Hello, honeys, and welcome back. This is, of course, your host, Celia speaking, and I am ready to report our headlines from the arts world from the last week here, the 14th through the 20th of September. Our sources for today are mostly our typical ones, Hyperallergic, ArtNet News, and we will also very soon be publishing this month's 5-minute musical, our music video breakdown, to our Patreon page for your very inexpensive purchase and listening. And we'll be going in a very different direction than last month with this Rihanna music video. Remember to keep your eyes out for that, and let's dive in for the day. A few updates on stories past here. The first is that an antiquities collector was sentenced for selling fake Picassos and Basquiats. The U.S. Attorney's Office said in a press release on Friday of last week that 77-year-old Carter Reese of Reading, Pennsylvania, was sentenced to 60 days in prison, 2 years of supervised release with 4 months on home detention, a $50,000 fine, and restitution of over $186,000 U.S. by Judge Jeffrey L. Schmel. Reese had pled guilty to wire fraud and mail fraud in connection with the schemes. He admitted in federal court in May that he had sold or attempted to sell forgeries by major artists from 2019 to 2021, while claiming when approaching buyers that he'd purchased them from collectors. Reese had worked as a fine arts and history teacher and later as director of admissions at a reputed local private prep school. He was also once Taylor Swift's neighbor in the small town of Wyomissing, Pennsylvania, before her move to Nashville to record her first album. We not only wanted to provide the honeys with the conclusion to this tale, but we also noticed it's not nearly as tough of a sentence as it could have and maybe should have been. Art News writes, quote, prior to his guilty plea, prosecutors were seeking up to 40 years in prison, end quote. Also last week, Le Monde and AFP reported that the Bayeux Tapestry did not make a high-stakes trip to an undisclosed location on September 18th for planned restoration work called an essential prerequisite by experts, ahead of its loan to the British Museum because of a new wave of national strikes over budget cuts. Since then, a spokesperson for the French presidency has stated that local authorities do not feel they are, quote, able to ensure the security of such a high-profile transfer, end quote, due to the strikes, so that work has been rescheduled for, quote, in the coming days, end quote. We noticed this headline because the historic loan has become a really controversial topic. Many experts continue to fear that the tapestry is too fragile to be moved at all. And as we covered last week, some French museums, cultural centers, heritage sites have had to close because of these strikes. A public artwork by a Venezuelan op art pioneer became the latest to be removed by Florida's Department of Transportation last week. The artwork titled Induction Chromatique by Venezuelan artist Carlos Cruz Diaz was unveiled during the 2017 Art Basel Fair, where it decorated a crosswalk in Coral Gables, Florida. The piece became a permanent installation after the city purchased the designs from the artist for $180,000. According to a statement from the gallery, which sponsored the Art Basel original, Cruz Diaz's sidewalk creations, quote, date back to 1975 in Caracas, where the artist created his first chromatic crosswalk. Since then, they have been realized in cities around the world, consistently bringing a poetic element of surprise to the daily routines of passerby and offering a fresh perspective on the relationship between art and everyday life, end quote. It was painted over because of a statewide memo issued June 30th by the Florida DOT banning, quote, any pavement or surface art or any markings not directly supporting traffic control or public safety on crosswalks and travel lanes, including pavement surface art, end quote. What I noticed about this headline, and especially the reporting on it, is this semi-weird justification from our sources. They cite WLRN reports that the city had lost touch with the artist's foundation and hadn't paid fees to maintain the crosswalks for the past 2 years. As Cruz Diaz died in 2019, our sources speculate the artwork may have been lost to degradation eventually anyway. That speculation and the use of the word anyway there rub me the wrong way, because it's one thing to allow art to be naturally lost to the elements, especially if that's the artist's intention. That is a natural inevitability in my mind. As far as we know, though, Cruz Diaz did not want this work rapidly erased by government employees with their own political agendas, which seems to me more like an unnatural intervention. Last week also saw the unveiling of a mural in support of immigrants in St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. The final work was unveiled on Thursday morning after installation teams have worked overnight for weeks to position Adam Shivanovic's panels. The work was entirely funded by private benefactors and was dedicated during Sunday Mass. Our sources say that the largest artwork ever commissioned for the neo-Gothic landmark is, quote, filled with Easter eggs of notable Catholic individuals who blend in with their surrounding subjects, end quote. For example, the first Native American person to be recognized as a saint, Kateri Tekakwitha, a Mohawk woman canonized in the 17th century for her devotion emotion and care for the sick. She's featured in a group panel, and the Lamb of God panel, which portrays Cuban abolitionist priest the Venerable Felix Varela y Morales, who lived in New York alongside St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, the first U.S. citizen to be recognized as a saint. The artwork's commissioner, Cardinal Dolan, who we might add is considered to be Manhattan's largest landowner as the overseer of the Archdiocese of New York and its 2.5 million Catholics, spoke from the podium with the artist standing slightly off to the side during this dedication. He said while speaking to the congregation, quote, "The whole issue of immigrants has been important for the church always, but it seems to be a little bit under the limelight today. Some have asked me, inner quotes, are you trying to make a statement about immigration, and inner quote, surely mainly that immigrants are children of God, end quote." Cardinal Dolan himself does not have a spotless history, but more important is that he is one such voice among many. The Catholic Church on the whole has consistently called for immigration reform, with leading bishops across the nation condemning Trump's mass deportation campaigns in recent months. Very Reverend Enrique Salvo, who was born in Nicaragua, said at the unveiling, quote, "If you had told me that I was going to be the rector of St. Patrick's Cathedral when I came to this country, I never would have believed it. Hopefully, the mural is an inspiration of that to everyone that walks in, that we're not only welcome, but we're also invited to make a difference," end quote. The artist similarly said to our sources that he's pleased to provide that sense of safety and welcome to the cathedral's visitors. However, we also learned that a Cuban museum has refused to lend certain artworks to MoMA due to U.S. customs laws. One of the more hotly anticipated fall exhibitions, MoMA's Wilfredo Lam retrospective called When I Don't Sleep, I Dream, will not feature artworks from the National Museum of Fine Arts in Havana because the latter worried that any artworks entering the United States could be seized by a U.S. court, quote, as part of claims by Cuban exiles and others seeking compensation for property confiscated in the revolution, end quote. The exhibition is set to feature 150 artworks from throughout the Afro-Cuban surrealist's life, but issues with bringing artworks over from Cuba specifically escalated in January of this year, when one of President Trump's first actions on Inauguration Day was to reinstate Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. That status had been briefly rescinded by the Biden administration. We're featuring this headline, honeys, because the curatorial team still made some successes, some discoveries through the exhibition development process. For example, they used infrared spectroscopy to determine that the jungle, 1942 through 43, was not made with gouache but oil. They also rediscovered long-lost artworks like Harpe Estrale and La Guerra Civil, yet their inability to connect or work with this Havana institution shows the impacts that these political stances can have on cultural access for us Americans. On a more serious note, a rope hung outside of an Atlanta Black History Museum is under investigation. In an Instagram post signed by the museum president and chief executive Dan Moore Jr., the Apex Museum of Atlanta reported finding a, quote, noose-like rope, end quote, in a tree. The institution has been devoted to Black history since its founding in 1978. This message also said the rope was, quote, deemed not to be a noose by Homeland Security and has since been removed from the premises for evidence, end quote. The post's accompanying picture shows Atlanta police at the scene, and local area WSB TV reports the incident is under formal investigation. As you might imagine, we care about this story because it is a rope hanging from a tree next to a Black cultural center. It's at best intimidation or a terrible mistake, but more likely an explicit threat. Moore wrote, quote, for Black communities in the United States, a noose is a symbol of terror representing lynchings, hatred, racial violence. Placed beside a museum dedicated to Black life and resilience, the rope reads as an act of intimidation, a clear message intended to wound, silence, and to remind people that the same threats and violence of our country's past can be conjured in the present, end quote. We also learned from the Houthi Culture Ministry that a series of Israeli airstrikes on Yemen hitting Sana'a as well as the northern province of Al-Jawf last Wednesday damaged the National Museum system in the capital of Sana'a. Even more tragically, according to the health ministry, those strikes killed more than 45 people and injured an additional 165. Last week's headlines also featured a couple of notable thefts. Cairo officials have launched a hunt for a pharaonic bracelet missing from an Egyptian museum. The object in question is a 3,000-year-old solid gold bracelet which once belonged to King Amenemope. The Egyptian museum's website explains that King Amenemope was a, quote, little-known but intriguing sovereign of Egypt's 21st dynasty, or about 1077 BCE to 943 BCE. The National Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities announced in a statement that it was last seen in the museum's restoration laboratory in Tahrir Square, along with other objects scheduled scheduled for the upcoming Treasures of the Pharaohs exhibition in Rome, the matter is now being handled by local law enforcement and the Public Prosecution Office. The ministry also added that photos of the bracelet and another very similar one have been distributed to all Egyptian airports, seaports, and land border crossings, quote, as a precautionary step to prevent smuggling attempts, end quote, and that museum workers are reviewing all the inventory in the lab. The second occurred in France. According to AFP and France 24, the thieves pulled off a heist of gold valued at about 600,000 euros or 700,000 US dollars from the Natural History Museum in Paris's 5th arrondissement in the nighttime robbery, which was detected on Tuesday morning. It's unclear right now if July's cyber attack, which disabled the museum's alarm and surveillance systems, was related to this week's theft, but we noticed it because the incident marks one of several French museum heists in recent months. Also last week, the Japanese Triennale faced protests over its backers' ties to Israel. The internationally watched recurring exhibition saw protests over ties between the nation and its namesake Aichi Prefecture, where the Triennale takes place and which provides funding for it. The protest issue centers on the Aichi Israel Matching Program, which is the result of a memorandum of understanding signed between the prefecture and the Israel Innovation Authority back in 2022, and which links companies in Aichi with startups based in Israel. Although no explicit links between the Triennale and the matching program exist, both get funding from the prefecture, hence the flack. An open letter circulating online in the recent weeks argues it is, quote, normalizing the world's first AI-powered genocide and tech-driven apartheid and willfully turning its businesses and workers into genocide collaborators, end quote. The letter also urges artists participating in the Triennale to demand the immediate cancellation of this matching program. Some of this year's participants have signed on to it. However, our sources point out that its curator, Hur al-Qasimi, director of the Sharjah Art Foundation, called Israel's military action a, quote, genocide and ethnic cleansing, end quote, at the exhibition's opening conference, before going on to say, quote, it's been a very emotional experience. I echo many people when they say none of us will be free until all of us are free, so free Palestine, end quote. We're highlighting this story, honeys, because as we've seen through the reporting this entire year, the art world refuses to forget about this genocide and continues 2 years in to protest around the world, send open letters, and take many other actions against the injustices. That fact is especially important and relevant this week as we learn that one of the No Other Land co-directors' homes was raided by the Israeli military. Investigative journalist Yuval Abraham, the film's co-director, was the first to make public on X the Israeli military's reported raid of the other co-director, Basil Adra's home in the occupied West Bank on September 13th. The raid followed an apparent attack in which a group of Israeli settlers attempted to run over Adra's brother with an all-terrain vehicle before physically attacking him, the brother, and one of Adra's cousins on Adra's own property in the Atuani village in Masafar Yatta. Adra's brother was hospitalized, according to his post detailing the attack. The perpetrators were identified as having come from Havat Moan, an illegal 600-person settlement that has reportedly solicited donations from residents of the U.S. to fund its paramilitary groups. Meanwhile, the Israeli military said its raid was in response to claims that Adra obviously denied of stones hurled at Israeli citizens. As you might recall, honeys, this incident is the latest in a series of violent attacks perpetrated against affiliates and members of the Israeli-Palestinian collective that produced the internationally acclaimed documentary film No Other Land on the Israeli occupation and forced displacement of the Masafar Yatta region. And because the news has been inescapable, we'll cover it as well. Jimmy Kimmel became the latest high-profile figure to be suspended from his job due to right-wing criticism of his remarks about the murdered activist Charlie Kirk. Kimmel is by no means alone, but is mostly joined by less famous figures, the most recent addition to that list being tenured art history professor Karen Leader at Florida Atlantic University. According to our sources, she's been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation following her social media posts about Kirk, in spite of the fact that Leader's posts in fact address Kirk's past statements and viewpoints rather than his death. She said in interviews with our sources, quote, many other people are having their reputations challenged because the right doesn't like what we say and they want to erase it from the historical record, end quote. She added, quote, this is about freedom of speech and freedom of expression and how much it is being crushed, end quote. And I have to agree with her, honeys. This consistent, active, across the disciplines and institutions, censorship, these challenges to freedom of speech should worry each and every one of us. And an explicit language warning for this next story. 5 members of the punk art collective known as Pussy Riot have been sentenced in absentia by Judge Evgenia Nikolay Kovaleva of Moscow's Basmany District Court to jail terms ranging from 8 to 13 years. The court claims they, quote, spread knowingly false information containing data about the deployment of the Russian armed forces, end quote, in a 2022 anti-war video that opens with the words, quote, the howls of Mariupol, end quote, which was the same year as that city's annexation by Russia. In addition to during other anti-Kremlin performances, for example, a 2024 performance at the Pinakothek der Moderne in Munich, during which a member urinated on a portrait of Putin. Pussy Riot's membership has fluctuated between 10 and 20 since its formation in 2011. They are known for their balaclava-wearing performances protesting Putin's regime and Russia's ongoing bombardment of Ukraine, which, according to a UN report released in August, has killed at least 13,883 civilians since its invasion in 2022. But one of the five, Diana Burkott, stated, quote, I stand by every single word and my anti-war stance is clear. The paradox is that rapists and murderers in Russia get 3 to 4 years. Meanwhile, activists receive monstrous sentences for their opinions, end quote. Last week also saw the Palestinian artist Samia Halabi become the second winner ever of the Munch Museum Award. Inaugurated last year, this award carries a prize of 300,000 Norwegian krones, or about $30,000 US, and recognizes artists for their, quote, long-standing courage and integrity, end quote. The jury specifically noted that Halabi, quote, has been a vocal critic of censorship in the arts for decades, which she herself has faced and overcome, end quote. Last week, a Jackson Pollock masterpiece was also found to contain an extinct form of manganese blue. The authors of a paper published in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences used Raman spectroscopy, a specific sort of laser analysis, to identify the mysterious hue in Pollock's signature number 1A from 1948. The new study proves that the abstract expressionist used an extinct synthetic paint which was popular in the 20th century but which was phased out in the 1990s due to environmental concerns related to its manufacture. The Why We Care is best put by MoMA conservation scientist Abed Haddad, who told ArtNet News, quote, it offers insights into the development of the artist's practice and understanding trends in the manufacture and use of certain colorants over time. This knowledge can be critical for developing effective strategies for display, since many pigments are sensitive to environmental factors such as intense light, UV radiation, and fluctuations in humidity, end quote. It was also announced last week that more recent studies using the latest imaging techniques of Vermeer's Girl with a Red Hat from circa 1664 to 1669, more specifically its underpainting, which was discovered about 3 years ago, shows that Vermeer's paintwork on that section was generally looser and done quickly. That fact has led National Gallery of Art specialists to now argue that the male portrait could be his own work versus that of someone in his studio. Although that argument has not yet been proven or denied, if it's true, if it's accurate, that would make this Vermeer's only known male portrait. Especially as that underpainting is dated to the 1650s, it would potentially give new insight into his early career, the portraits painted before his religious subjects of the mid-1650s as well. And also last week, Egyptian archaeologists identified a rare, complete, and previously unknown copy of a royal hieroglyphic edict issued by King Ptolemy III Euergetes dating back to 238 BCE, known as the Canopus Decree. The decree had been disseminated for display in major temples around the country and sanctified the king, his wife Bernice II, and their daughter. It also outlined religious reforms and royal donations across Egypt. Discovery of it was made at the Tel El Farain archaeological site in the city of El Husseiniya. In the Ptolemaic period, this was a major Nile Delta urban center called Emet. The finding matters because it may provide further insight into ancient Egyptian linguistics as well as social, political, and religious structures, as it contains information such as tax relief policies and a leap year system. Another major headline from last week, Trump officials have reportedly ordered that a reproduction of a famous 19th century photograph of a formerly enslaved man, which is currently held at the Fort Pulaski National Monument, a Civil War battle site in Georgia, be removed. The headline was first reported on September 15th, while the photo's location was confirmed by the New York Times the next morning. Titled The Scourged Back from 1863, the photo displays brutal scar tissue from past whippings of a self-emancipated, formerly enslaved man looking back over his shoulder, who was only known as Peter and who escaped from a Louisiana plantation before enlisting in Union forces. Our sources write, quote, the image, testifying to the sheer terror of slavery, became a galvanizing abolitionist cry and was widely circulated in Harper's Weekly, end quote. This is also a much alluded to image. For example, artist Arthur Jaffa has included versions of it in recent installations, and one held in very high regard by prestigious institutions like the National Portrait Gallery, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the National Gallery of Art. The why for this photo's removal is pretty obvious. Trump ordered the Secretary of the Interior in his March executive order banning quote-unquote race-centered ideology to ensure that monuments in its jurisdiction, quote, do not contain descriptions, depictions, or other content that inappropriately disparage Americans past or living, including persons living in colonial times, and instead focus on the greatness of the achievements and progress of the American people, end quote. The overseer of the National Park Service, the Department of the Interior, subsequently notified National Park employees in June that quote-unquote inappropriate content would be modified by September 17th. A spokesperson for the Department of Interior said in a statement to our sources that reports of exhibit removals were, quote, false claims that are not grounded in verified facts, end quote. Yet still, this story has sparked a ton of outcry, honeys, because it seems like an erasure of the uglier parts of American history, especially because this is not the first time it's happened this year, nor is this the first object, plaque, monument, photo, whatever, to be attacked for its relation to the history of slavery. We covered the Trump administration ordered removal of a sign a few weeks back. In that case, it was the removal of a sign criticizing the Lost Cause myth from Manassas National Battlefield Park, a Civil War battleground active in 1861 and 62. That myth refers to the idea that slavery was not the central cause of the Civil War and claims that the institution of slavery was benevolent. The orders to remove the sign as well as the photograph also follow a directive from the Trump administration to remove the T for trans and Q for queer, as well as many references to bisexuality from the LGBTQ+ acronym on the Stonewall National Monument and its website. These attempts to silence and rewrite history will not go unnoticed, at least by this podcast. Bringing things back to a lighter note for our final few stories, Cause was named Uniqlo's first artist in residence. Starting immediately, the entrepreneur and hypebeast patron saint Cause, aka Brian Donnelly, will begin leading an expansion of the Japanese company's Art for All philosophy by curating art events across its stores worldwide and collaborating with the brand's various museum partners, which include the MoMA of New York, the Tate Modern, the Louvre, and the MFA Boston. We learned that the New Yorker has now tripled its non-illustrated cover artist number by hiring 6 contemporary photographers to reimagine historical illustrated covers via celebrity portraits in honor of the magazine's centennial. The photographers are Marilyn Minter, Awal Arizku, Ryan McGinley, Collier Shore, Camila Falquez, and Alex Prager. The vast majority of New Yorker covers over the magazine's history have been illustrations, a William Wegman portrait of a Weimaraner on the February 20th and 28th, 2000 covers, and a Cindy Sherman self-portrait on the September 1st and 8th, 2025 issues were the only ones to break that mold until now. Art News points out that an unexpected side effect, however, of viewing the anniversary covers alongside their inspirations, quote, is noticing the New Yorker's price increases over the years. In 1925, the magazine cost 15 cents. By 1974, it was up to 50 cents and $3 in 1999, end quote. And now, non-subscribers to the magazine will pay $9.99 for these anniversary editions. And our final story for the day, we learned last week that Sotheby's has scored one of the biggest consignments announced yet for November's New York City sales, with $400 million in art from the collection of Leonard Lauder, who passed in July. New York Times, first to report the news, said that it will feature Klimt's portrait of Elizabeth Lederer from 1914 to 16, which itself is expected to sell for more than $150 million. It is also thought to be one of the few full-length Klimt portraits still held privately. The Lauder sale will also include 6 bronzes by Henri Matisse, collectively worth $30 million, a $20 million Edvard Munch painting, and an Agnes Martin painting valued at over $10 million US. News of this consignment came only a few days after The Guardian reported that Sotheby's had lost $248 million across 2024. But Sotheby's chief executive said of the Lauder sale to New York Times, quote, I think we're going to make history with this collection. It will be something talked about for a long time, end quote. Some much needed good news for the auction house. That's our show for the day, folks. Hope you've enjoyed. Please feel free to DM us or comment on our Patreon, our Substack, wherever, with any questions, comments, hopefully not concerns. We'll catch you again soon with our next 5-minute musical and our final Beesness for September. But until then, hydrate or dihydrate. Take care. We'll talk soon. This podcast is produced, created, hosted, formerly edited, and fact-checked by master's degree holder Celia Bugnout. Chris Meinhold is responsible for our editing, mixing, and our intro and outro music. Special thanks to him for that. And as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, comment, so on all your favorite listening as well as social media channels.